Recording in progress.
So we'll be going over 2 Samuel chapters 10 and 11. So 2 Samuel chapter 10 starts off with David's kindness to Hanun. After King Nahash of Ammon dies, David sends few of his men to console his son Hanun in return for the kindness King Nahash had shown him. Hanun's advisors, the Ammonite nobles, suspect that David wasn't really showing kindness, returning his kindness to King Nahash. Rather, they thought that David was sending these men to spy out the city, and they convinced Hanun to humiliate these men that David sent. So they did this by shaving half their beards off and cutting their garments at the waist, which deeply insulted them. Then, realizing that they have angered David, the Ammonites hired 33,000 Aramean foot soldiers from various regions, like from Beth Rehob, Zobah, king of Makkah, and from Tob. And David sends Joab and the Israelite army to respond to that threat. So Joab finds himself between the Ammonites in the front and the Arameans behind, and he divides his forces, leading part of the army against the Arameans, while his brother Abishai fights the Ammonites. The Arameans, they flee first, which caused the Ammonites to retreat as well. And then later, the Arameans regroup under Hadadezer, bringing reinforcements from beyond the Euphrates River. David personally leads the Israelite army to battle at Helam. Israel decisively defeats the Arameans, killing their commander Shobak, 700 charioteers, and 40,000 foot soldiers. And the remaining Aramean kings surrender and refuse to help the Ammonites again, and they made peace with the Israelites and became subject to them. Chapter 11. So during the springtime is when the kings typically go to war. David stays behind in Jerusalem instead of leading his troops against the Ammonites, and this is what sets the stage for his moral failure. So one evening, David sees Bathsheba from his palace rooftop, and she was bathing. He inquires about her and learns that she is the wife of Uriah the Hittite, who is a loyal soldier to David. Despite knowing that she is married, David sends for her and sleeps with her. Bathsheba later sends word that she's pregnant with his child. So David tries to cover up this sin. So David summons Uriah from the battlefield, hoping that he will sleep with Bathsheba and believe the child is his. But Uriah refuses to go home, saying that it would be dishonorable while Israel's army is at war. Even after David gets him drunk, Uriah remains committed to his duty and sleeps at the entrance of the palace gate. So David orders for Uriah's death. David sends Uriah back to battle with a sealed letter instructing Joab to place Uriah in the most dangerous position and withdraw support, ensuring his death. And I find this kind of ironic, sending Uriah with the his own death sentence. And then we see that Uriah is killed in the battle, and Joab sends a messenger to inform David. But Joab instructed the messenger to first tell David about how the battle was going and how that they were very close to the city walls. And if David gets angry, then to tell him about Uriah being killed in battle, so that David will calm down, because essentially, David wanted to kill Uriah, and that was his main intention. So then, after Uriah's death, David quickly marries Bathsheba, attempting to make the situation appear normal, thinking that, oh, since Uriah is a loyal soldier of mine, I should take care of his wife as well. But this chapter ends with the key statement that, but the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. So this chapter marks a turning point in David's life, where he shifts from being a man after God's heart to abusing his power. Unlike the previous chapters, when David inquired of the Lord, here he acts impulsively and selfishly. That's the end of the summary. Any thoughts or questions?
Thank you, Reva. I guess I can share one of the initial thought, and of course we can keep it going. But taking out, there's obviously a huge, a majority of the discussion going to be from chapter 11. So before we get into that, I'm just gonna, we all should try to just kind of get through some things in chapter 10. So I was looking at one key thing, how we've already talked about it in the summary, but the complete victory against the Ammonites had not been won until David also joined the battle. At first, he sent Joab and Abishai, and it's crazy because the men are called, like all of like the men who fight for Israel, they're called the host of the mighty men. Like David's era of leadership really redefined what the kingdom of Israel became, right? In every sense. Their military, top notch, right? And it's crazy to think, like, look how far these people came, right? You think of them wandering in the wilderness in, like from Egypt, and when they first were trying to conquer the promised land, and like think of how weak they were. But even then, like their strength was God, the Lord. But it just, just taking a step back and seeing how far, they've come as a people. Uh, and that's that because it's only because of the favor of God, the hand of God with them and not against them. But we see that the complete victory is not won until David went out to lead and fight as king. That's what he should do. I feel like that is a huge tell for, you know, drastics, like something is wrong for the next chapter because we see David does not go out with his men because when it's the springtime, what kings are supposed to do is like they should finish unfinished business. They don't fight in whatever winter season that they have. So when it's spring, they finish wars and battles. So David was needed there. It wasn't enough that he had sent Joab and Abishai and his men. Um, that really just set a stage of idleness, right? Like the perfect environment for the enemy to make you fall, compromise holiness. So if anybody wants to follow up with that, anything else from chapter 10, maybe? Any more observations before we start talking about chapter 11? Maybe if, I realize that there doesn't seem to be a lot, but verse 12 maybe, what Joab says to who is he saying this to? Abishai, maybe? I think he's saying this to his brother. But in verse 12, Joab says, "Be of good courage, and let us be courageous for our people and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him." Right? Um, that that reminds me of the what our focus is for the month, right? About yielding to God's will. Um, we see that Joab and Abishai, they're prepared, they're making the choice to be courageous, right, for our people. They realize who this people is. It's not just another battle. They're not just another people. They're the people of God. They're fighting for the cities of God. And and then of course they yield to the Lord for God to do whatever seems good to him, not to lean entirely on their wisdom. I feel like these are some key things that David David loses sight of in the following chapter. He's supposed to go out. He's supposed to be of good courage and be courageous for his people. He's supposed to go out in the springtime and he should do what he should is supposed to do as a king. He's supposed to fight for the cities of God, right? Because juxtapose that with a younger David before he was anything at all, while he was still a shepherd boy, right? When no one took his anointing calling seriously, he was nowhere close to being king. But he left the entire camp of Israel, King Saul included, speechless when David was questioning why the army of God was cowering in fear before the uncircumcised Gentile Goliath, right? So, a huge shift. Oftentimes we let the comfort that God gives us somehow, we twist it into an environment to do what grieves God. So in this case, David does not fight courageously for his people or the city of God, and he does not do what seems good to the Lord. David has seen with his own eyes, and he's experienced so many times in his life that it is following the will of God that has given him favor and victory. Yep. Okay. Well, if we want to move on, we can move on. I guess, I mean, if you know, if we want to get through like loyalty, like David remembers the loyalty of the king of the Ammonites, the late king of the Ammonites. So it wasn't as if David was just going out conquering everything before his like path. You know, he remembered like, and it also wasn't as if he was showing loyalty to the Ammonites because of his own wisdom either. I feel like there's a very fine line. Like it wasn't as if David was, he wasn't fighting, and he also wasn't like choosing peace because of what seemed right to him and his own counsel. You know, if an alliance like this wasn't what God wanted, God would have told him. God would have made that clear. I mean, when he consulted God, which he did before his endeavors, it would have been made clear to him. But we see that the Ammonites chose to, dishonor the Israelites and insult them. And they were the ones who started gathering troops, right? So they had been insulted. David was insulted. The messengers were insulted, but David wasn't the one who started the battle. He didn't go and question or anything. The Ammonites themselves started hiring the Syrians and were preparing themselves for an ambush against Israel. Okay, we can move on to chapter 12. So, who wants to bring out, like, this is, because think about, okay, when we talk, not 12, 11, when we start talking about chapter 11, a lot of different, um, how do I say, approaches, angles in which you could take this. Like, think of, you know, the relationship between God and David, what we know about it, how, and this is why it's so valuable that we're reading chapter by chapter by chapter, not skimming, not going back and forth, like, like it's not a weird thing. We have read about David's life up until this point. We know how God has spoken to him, how he has spoken to God. We know about David's choices. We know about his victories and also like failures and shortcomings. On this is not David's like first failure or shortcoming. This is probably like the greatest gravity of the thing of the things that he has done. But we have seen the tiny things that have been, I don't think those are completely independent of this sin that he did. I feel like those were building up and leading up to this. But like we can talk about that. We can talk about the nature of sin again, holiness, right? Like how is David compromising holiness? How is David rejecting God's will? How do we see that in the word? Um and yeah, how many laws exactly is David breaking all at once, right? So anyway, just giving you, don't think that what you can speak is can easily be exhausted. The list of things that can be talked about is not easily exhausted, so don't stay silent. So anybody who wants to take over with an angle to talk about this chapter, go on ahead.
I think for sure David broke two of God's commandments. The first being do not commit adultery, the second being do not murder. Like David himself didn't stab Uriah, but like he gave the command. So in a sense he is a murderer.
No, 100%.
So yeah. And then one of the reasons why I think God was displeased was because David, the one he helped anoint uh into kingship, broke not one but two commandments in one go. And then he killed someone that was, in my opinion, he was walking in the way God wanted him to walk. Uriah was, he knew that the soldiers and the Ark of the Covenant was still in the tent, so he didn't go home himself because he decided, since the Ark of the Covenant and the people that are going to war are in at their homes, he will stay away from home just like them.
Yeah, I'm so
And I
glad that.
thought that was a
Oh no,
yeah.
please continue. I thought you were done. Please
No,
continue.
so I just thought like if like I think God will be pleased with Uriah for how he did it. Because like since the Ark of the Covenant isn't in like since it's still in a tent away, then it makes sense why he shouldn't be home. He should be trying to bring it back to the city.
Yeah, you yourself now just delivered like so many things, like just a plethora of things that can be talked about yourself. Um, but like yeah, I mean, first things first, what you said about the Ten Commandments, what I want to follow up on that is I'm kind of refreshing my memory on the Ten Commandments, and let's see, you shall have no other gods before me. I mean, we know the deep relationship that David had with God to the point like David wasn't like everybody else. He was constantly in pursuit of God's heart. But if for this brief moment of time, if God no longer becomes his main priority, then is he not serving something else, right? He has some kind of God before God, right? So one can argue, okay, like the first one seems to be in jeopardy. Second, you shall not make for yourself a carved image. Okay, he didn't go out and like, sculpt an idol or anything, but I don't know. What is in God's place in David's heart right now? David is at this point in his life, he is in a position that's he's much more powerful than Saul at this point in his like kingly career, right? So what exactly is he idol? I mean, he's idolizing Bathsheba. He's probably idolizing the passions of his flesh. Uh, there's
Another
all there.
that
Well,
David broke. I just looked at it. It was do not covet your neighbor's house, his wife, his ox, or any of his other possessions.
yeah, exactly. But yeah,
Those three.
that cannot be ignored at all. Um, so yeah, that too.
And he stole, so the do not steal four.
Exactly.
He was
Exactly. I
trying to
mean,
make a
arguments can be made for like one and two in like a certain sense. Arguments can be made for those. Murder, yep. Adultery, steal, um, covet. You shall not covet. So yeah, he's of the law. Uh, wow. Um, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Nothing really happened to that degree, but I feel like um well, he was not about to accuse anybody. I don't know. This might be a stretch, but all I'm
when
saying
he
is
tried
right, exactly.
when he tried like marrying that Shiva right away, it's just so for everyone else it looked like he was doing something proper.
Yeah,
That was that was something false, right?
yeah,
So it's considerate that way.
yeah,
That it
exactly.
was false testimony.
Yeah, a false testimony, and that exactly, 100% that. And say, say you're like because David's first plan A, was not to kill Uriah, but to make it seem as if this child belonged to Uriah. So if that course was also taken, then it would all been a lie. He's fabricating falseness. So yeah. How? Isn't this crazy? Like what a whiplash, what a switch up from everything that we've been reading about him so far. Like, like once you start falling, it's not it can be such a grave and dangerous fall. But the most dangerous thing about this is that he doesn't realize right away the graveness of his failures. He's instead kind of stepping stones, like one thing is leading to another, which is leading to another. Yeah. And what you said about the arc, I mean, I'm not gonna like beat a dead horse. Anybody else want to talk about like what Nevin Chechen mentioned about the ark, or what Uriah said about the ark of God? That's huge. Like think about it in respects to David, everything about David and the ark of God that we've been talking about so far. Like what makes this so crazy? like as soon as David's official kingship started, what was like basically the first thing that David wanted to do? When Trump came into office, he had things from the get-go that he wanted to get done. His pen was ready to like sign orders. There were things as soon as he sat down, not even a day had passed before he signed things into order. So as soon as David came in to power, there was only one thing inhabiting his mind, and that was to know where the location of the Ark of God was and to bring it to where he was ASAP, right? That and he got that wrong too. Remember, he made mistakes because he didn't go to the law to see how the ark was supposed to be transported, but he eventually gets it right. And once he brings it, he dances like a madman before the ark of God. He loves it truly. You know, he loves not the object, but the presence of God. He wants it to be by his side forever. And what was the most recent thing that we read about David and the ark of God? Like, what did David want to do for the ark of God? Like a couple of chapters ago, what was on David's mind?
Was it to make a temple for it?
Yeah,
Or like a
yeah,
house?
exactly. Right. That was like occupying David's thoughts. It troubled him that the ark of God was in a tent while he lived in like a palace of cedar, a house of cedar, right? And then like it's not what God. That's not God's priority or anything. That's not what he wants. But like he honors how much David prioritizes what God wants or to do things for God, right? And now coming back to the present, to chapter 11, how messed up is it that David found it okay? His senses were so numb. Right? That's how I want to think about it. He was so numb to the fact that he was living he was relaxing in that house, in that palace of cedar, while the ark of God was with the rest of the army in the middle of battle. He's supposed to be there. He's the king. He's supposed to be leading this fight. He's supposed to be where the ark of God is. So how can David, who a couple of chapters ago was so concerned about the correct, the appropriate honoring of the ark, albeit, that's not what God wanted, but like still, we see where his heart was, David's heart is. But now it doesn't seem to bother him that much that the ark is far away, the ark is not home, but he's home, right? Uriah, who's not even a native Israelite, Uriah is not a native Jew. He's a Hittite. He's, I don't know, probably the descendants of like Hittites or something like that. Like, I didn't look into his lineage or anything, but like, that's why they call him Uriah the Hittite. He's either not a full-blooded Israelite or he's not originally from the region or anything like that. But somehow he knows, right? Somehow he is so faithful to the fact that I can't go home and spend time with my wife and I can't relax and I can't take part in, the goodness and peace and stuff when the people of God and the ark of God are away fighting in the midst of battle. I need to be where they are. So, I mean, I don't know. It doesn't say, but I wonder, could that have like poked at David's heart just a little bit? Did did David not feel anything at all when he heard Uriah say that? Or did he, and he just conveniently chose to push it to the back of his mind because his sin took the forefront? Right? I feel like that was one of the ways of escape that I mean not escape, but like the reminders that God was giving him to repent, to not continue on this path. But like David just brushes that aside. I mean, I don't know what to imagine, but like I wish I could see what David's face looked like when he heard Uriah say that. Was there guilt? Was there, I don't know. All right, anything else from chapter 11, guys? Do we think there were any kind, like, what made the perfect environment for this to happen, right? Like, what were the different factors that came together, um, that allowed David to fall into this sin? You know, I'm thinking about David's character. We know that he's a man after God's heart, and he yielded a lot of things before God to know what God's will is before he made choices and decisions. But remember how many times we repeated, what is the area in David's life? I mean, one of the sole areas in David's life that he did not yield to God, that he never submitted to God. What was that area in David's life?
Like his love life.
Yeah, yeah. His love life, his marriages, his rearing of children, like none of that. God was never included in any of that, which seems so, that's weird. But that is also us, because we are often content with, I mean, if we give God a majority of our lives, like a majority of the different realms of our life, we want to give ourselves pats on the back, but like God wants it all. Not because he's selfish and he wants to, like, rob us of he wants every single realm of our life to be blessed and to meet its ultimate potential. We know how blessed David was as a king, as a commander, whatever. Like the choices that we see how much God's favor led him. So why would it be any different in his marriages, right? His role as a husband and as a father. If he would have yielded and committed that to God, how blessed would his life be ultimately? But we said that was the one realm that he didn't give up to God. And I feel like that, that sowed a lot of seeds, which produced this ultimately bitter fruit in this chapter. Because if that had been straightened from the get-go, if David showed as much zeal to offer that part of his life to God, just as he did every other part, then this would not have ever happened, because he would have been satisfied with godly with godly a godly marriage, because it wasn't God's will for David to amass all these wives and concubines, and godly fatherhood. But that, I mean, listen, like, a world of hurt is just coming. We're just starting to read how everything's gonna go south. We're gonna see how David fails as a father as well, and then the following chapters. But yeah, that definitely cultivated an environment for sin. So let's be honest with ourselves and point out, what are the things in my life that I'm not yielding to God, yielding to God's perfect will, and how is that growing into something that's dangerous? How is that growing into something that will ultimately make me fall, make me reject holiness entirely? This did not happen overnight. This did not happen overnight. It was gradual. It was him compromising little by little. Um, you know, it this lack of self-control. All the women, all the children that he was raising, this lack of self-control and restraint, all of this led to these consequences. Um, Proverbs 16, verse 27. Anybody wants to take and read that really quickly? I don't want to take too much time taking references, but Proverbs 16, verse 27.
A scoundrel plots evil, and on their lips it is like scorching fire.
Ooh, I might have picked the wrong reference. 28. Can you try 28? Let me check. I guess that's also relevant, I guess, that verse, because David started to plot evil, right? The only thing that occupied his thoughts was always pleasing God, pleasing God, pleasing God. But now it's being replaced by plotting how to save his own skin, right? Not to look dishonorable. Who does that remind you of? Kind of reminds me of Saul, but in a way more darker sense. Saul also cared a lot about saving his own skin and keeping appearances. Right now, the only thing that David seems to be caring about, by each of his decisions, is saving face and keeping appearances. You can save face before man. A bunch of people said it, and I'm judging read, but a bunch of people said it like it from the outside it looks really good. Oh, David honored a dutiful soldier by making sure his widow was not left uncared for. Wow, awesome. What a great human being. What a great king. You can convince people of anything, but God sees all. You can't hide things from God. That's not the verse that I wanted to bring up though. Let me find the right reference. It should be somewhere in there. Proverbs 16, somewhere in between 27 and 29. Don't worry about it. It says, an idle brain is the devil's workshop. An idle brain, you've probably heard it as like like a proverb, as like a thing that, like a wise saying, but it comes from the Bible. An idle mind is the devil's workshop. So when you are idle, when you're not occupied with anything fruitful, idleness is not the same thing as rest. All right. That's not talked about often enough. Proper rest is completely different from idleness. Idleness is when you're supposed to be doing things and you're actively avoiding that, and you're just continuing in laziness and lack of productiveness. Rest is when you're taking well-earned rest and recharge from after having done the things that are according to God's will. Anywho, idleness is the devil's workshop because he gets you right where he wants you, the enemy. When you're idle, the enemy can inject things into your mind and use your hands and your feet to do his will rather than God's will. So idleness in our lives, and you know where it is. I know where idleness is in my own life, something that I struggle with as well. But it's so much more than I didn't get anything done today. Oh, it was just a waste of a day. It's a lot more than that Satan can use it to make you fall hard and make you grieve God and make you compromise holiness. That's what we see. David was supposed to be with the rest of his army tying up loose ends in Rabbah against the Ammonites. We saw that how necessary David was for the battle last time. And so to finish things off, he was supposed to be there too. But he's not. He's chilling at home. And he gets up, he's relaxing, resting on like the couch or the bed or something. He gets up and he walks around on the roof, and that's when he sees Bathsheba. So the enemy is a big fan of cultivating environments to make you sin, to make you fall. Don't give him that inch. The more inches that you give him, like, he's going to take miles and miles. All right. We're almost done with time. Leviticus 20, verse 10, like when we revisit the law and how serious the law was, and still like wasn't like in David's time. He's supposed to uphold the law as king. Laws on adultery, right? How the man and the woman were supposed to be put to death. Those who participated in adultery. Never at one point does David go to the Lord with his sin. He is just trying to cover things up. It shows us how sin and like lack of holiness, it separates you from God. And that makes sense. Like, God cannot dwell anywhere that is not holy. It's apart from him. It's hostile to him. And we see sin actively makes us separate ourselves from God. We don't see David being in God's presence. He doesn't go to God's presence. That sin is actively keeping him away. It's easier for him to try to fix things himself and try to cover up his guilt than expose it before God and repent. Yep. So often God's will requires us, like holiness requires us to forsake like the luxury and the comfort and the easiness for God's will. We often, our flesh craves the luxury, comfort, and easiness, but that can lead us to sin. If that comfort, whatever we think is rest, I don't know if David was thinking that, he should rest a little bit more. He's already done so much for Israel, so it's okay for him to rest a little bit more at home. He's king anyway, so he can do whatever he wants. He's a king, right? But God's will is not the easy way out, ever. Um, anything else? The fact that even when Uriah was drunk, right? David deliberately tried to get Uriah drunk that second time and make him go back to his house. Uriah didn't. Even when he was drunk, he stayed at like the outside of the king's palace. So we see that faithfulness there with him, and like the refusal to compromise holiness. Where in fact David was drunken just spiritually. He was not in his senses. His senses were dulled, numbed, as if he was drunk. Yeah. Also, this is just a side note, like that thing about the woman who threw a millstone down from like the wall and killed that guy. That's a reference to like a battle that happened in the book of Judges 9 verse 50 to 57. I don't remember which judge it was during that time, but there was a battle. Uh, uh, um, and this guy named Abimelech, who was fighting for Israel during that time, he was killed because he got too close to the wall of the enemy, and this woman threw a millstone down and killed him. Right. So that reference that Joab is making is just Joab saying, if David knows that we as the Israelite army got too close to the enemy wall, David's going to ask, well, what incarnation were you thinking? Like, don't you know that that is a terrible battle strategy? Don't you remember the casualties that happened in our people's history back in Judges when they tried to do that and people died? So like it's a reference that's pointing to that. Like it's a reason why the army is not typically supposed to get too close to the enemy's wall, but that was done anyway because of David's instructions to send Uriah to the thick of the battle to kill him. So it's crazy how David was willing to compromise the lives of God's people in battle to cover up his sin. Shrewd activities and thinking, but that's not really far away from what we're capable of as well. When we sin, we don't think honestly, straightly, and we're more comfortable with you know just we're comfortable with casualties. Like it's an old like the David of the past would not accept that. But this slight military setback did not seem as bad to David, even though it cost the lives of Israelites. It didn't seem so bad to David because it helped him cover up his sin, which is so like beyond, it makes you wonder like who is this, right? Yeah, he's not reacting as he does usually, and that's the effect of sin. He is downplaying these defeats in more ways than one. He's not just downplaying the military defeats, he's also downplaying his own spiritual defeat as something that can be, excuse me, brushed under the rug. All right. So let's close this discussion with the last verse. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. This is the first time that God is being mentioned in this chapter at the very last verse. And that has nothing to do with David actively seeking him or speaking with him, right? This is the first time God is being mentioned in the last verse. So it's showing you that in itself is also showing us like what David, how grave that fall was, that failure was, that kept him from God's presence, made him conveniently, not submit to himself because he knew of like that this was a sin, but that's just the way the enemy operates, makes you so numb to the things that you've always known and makes you comfortable. And then makes you want to preserve yourself. Wow. And to think that this is still, David is still the person that God calls a man after my own heart. We're going to see in the following chapters what David does to come back. But, this is enough to kind of taint our opinion of David forever. And even yet, even still, and yet, Jesus somehow still came from David's line. God refused to strip David away from the covenant that God promised him, that his throne would be established forever. God could simply have stripped that all away in a moment. But we're gonna read more about that. But God was very displeased. Hey, searching after God's will, wanting to do what pleases God, that's all great, but a moment of compromise can make you do things that displease God heavily. I feel like displease does not do justice to, what exactly God was feeling. It was grieved him, hurt him heavily. And once you fall in that manner, you're not even aware. You don't care. You're not aware of how what you're doing is so twisted and distant from what God's will is. How much you are away from holiness. Okay, we're closing our discussion.